Well, before we get started this morning, I forgot to mention anything to the folks up there, but the screen's not working down here. So if you can figure that out up there, hopefully that'd be great. There we go. So throughout 1 Samuel, we have what's called chiasms all throughout that. You can remember what chiasms are? Chiasms is basically at the start of a story, someone's on top, and typically they're the bad guy in the story. They're the prideful person in the story. And God, towards the end of the story, will bring them low. And there's someone at the beginning of the story who is humble, who's low, and that God is going to elevate them by the end of the story. And that's what we see throughout 1 Samuel. That's what we see throughout 1 Samuel. And over the last couple of weeks, we have seen it with Saul and David. You know, Saul, he's on the top. He's the king. He's on top. But Saul, he's not a godly man at all. And God has actually removed his blessing from Saul. He's going to bring Saul low. He's going to humble him. And he's going to take a young guy named David, a young man who's faithful, and he's going to elevate him. And today we are actually in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 12, all the way through the end of chapter 20. And so feel free to turn there in your smartphones, or turn in your Bibles, pull up your smartphones, if I say this correctly. You can also see where your sermon notes, it's in your bulletins. I can't talk this morning. I should restart this, all right? Having your sermon notes, the page numbers, or the pew number in front of you, pews. Can we just start right over again? So there's pew Bibles in front of you. There's page numbers listed about that. And you can follow along on the screen too. I'm just going to read from my notes from now on. So anyways, as you turn there, what we see there is that that God has been elevating this guy. You know, David, he's been faithful. Everywhere that God has placed him, David has been faithful. So God's going to continue to elevate him. David, he's been a good son to his father. He was faithful as a shepherd. Then he becomes a musician for Saul, and he was faithful there. And Saul loves him, so then he promotes him to an armor bearer, and then he defeats Goliath. And then he becomes kind of like one of the main generals over his whole army. But something happens. Chapters 18 through 20 is great to help us see how David responds when things do not go the way that he thought they would go. And so before we dig into the text, our big idea for today is that we are called to be ruled by God, not our circumstances or our feelings. We're called to be ruled by God, not our circumstances or our feelings. And so what we see here in chapter 18 is that Saul actually will demote David. He's going to demote David. And it's not because David made a mistake. It's not because David has, it's what's really been because David's been so successful that Saul is jealous of David's work. I can remember the beginning of chapter 18, which we talked about last week. They had come back from battle, and the people were singing that Saul had slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Because, that infuriated Saul. Because David's receiving more glory and more fame than he is. So Saul, he demotes David. He's no longer being one of the main generals of his army. He gives him just a segment of the army. And we read that in verses 12 through 13. So Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in campaigns. So again, David, he's just going to lead a group of 1,000 people. But you know what? David's response is remarkable. We get a glimpse of this guy's character. He's done nothing wrong, but he's been demoted. And so David's response is that he's going to continue to be faithful even though there's unjust treatment. Verse 14. It says that in everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. Again, David, he continued to be faithful. Again, would a lesser person do that? A lesser person would gripe and complain if they lost their job, right? A lesser man might even start a coup, right? I'll just start my own thing. David could have done that, but he's not going to. He's going to be faithful where God has placed him. And when things don't go the way that we think or the way that we hope or what we deserve, we get angry. But David, he just continues to take it, and he continues to be faithful in all that. But in verse 19, it actually gets worse. Not only does Saul demote David, Saul also disrespects David. Again, remember what was promised to David because of his defeat of Goliath. He was supposed to be able to join the king's family. He was going to be promised to marriage to a daughter of Saul. And so David, he's supposed to marry Saul's firstborn daughter. He was promised to Meribib. But now, Saul has withdrawn that promise. He took it away. David's not going to be able to marry his firstborn daughter. We read that in verse 19. It says, so when time came for Merib, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given to Adriel of Meholah. So again, Saul demotes David, he disrespects David, and then also he even deceives David. In verse 20, it says Saul hears a rumor that Michal, his other daughter, actually loves David, just loves him. It's not that Saul has a change of heart, but we read why he does this in verse 21. It says, I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. So Saul, he's willing to allow his daughter Michal to marry David. But Saul, he does not have a high view of his daughter at all. He believes that she will be a snare to him. You know, Michal, she's actually very similar to Saul. She's not a very spiritual person. She actually has idols that we keep. We read that in chapter 19. And it's because this Saul realizes that she could be a trap to David. That Michal and her idols might be able to woo David away from God. And if David's not following God, then the blessing of God won't be on David, and then the Philistines can come in and just wipe him out. So that's how deceptive Saul is. So Saul was willing to give this daughter to David, but also in the midst of us, there's a dowry that's in place. There's a bride price. There's a payment in order to be married to his daughter. And David has to earn that. And we read that here in verse 25. And Saul replied, say to David, the king has no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge of his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. And in their culture, a dowry was, some money or some kind of goods that you would give to a father in order to marry his daughter. And that was not a good custom, but that was a custom nonetheless back then. But a dowry for Michal is something that's out of the ordinary. It's 100 foreskins. That's kind of weird. And again, we wouldn't really see a VeggieTales episode about that, right? A little weird, but basically Saul wants David to circumcise these Philistines' dead bodies that would defeat in battle, because he's trying to make it impossible for David to do this, to accomplish this, that he might die in battle for this to happen. But you know what? Saul's plan, it backfires. It backfires. In verses 26 and 29, David actually gets the dowry. And this causes Saul to realize that God is with David, which causes Saul to become even more afraid of David, that he becomes terrified of him. He's frightened. He's paranoid. It's because everything that David does, he's victorious in, that the hand of God is clearly on David. Not only does Saul's daughter loves David, not only is he victorious in everything, we read this in verse 30. It says, the Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known amongst them. David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. Another translation actually says that David behaved himself more than all of Saul's officers. And this is kind of saying that there was respect amongst the Philistine people because of David. He was different than all the rest of the other military people that they came across. His name became even well known even amongst the enemies of God. And it's because of this, now we make the transition to chapter 19. Saul is going to now seek to destroy David. And Saul seeks to destroy David. It didn't work in the past, but Saul is going to try again. Saul was trying to deceive David and try to get the Philistines to kill him, Now he decides to do it himself. So Saul pronounces an edict saying that David is to be killed, and we read that here in chapter 19, verse 1. And Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David. I think here, Saul is trying to capitalize on what we read in chapter 18, verse 30. Since the Philistines' view of David was very high regard, Saul's trying to paint David in a negative light. I think he's trying to show his people, the Israelite people, that David is an imposter, that he's a fraud, that he's not a servant of Israel, but he's an enemy of the state. Since the Philistines respect David, Saul's trying to use that to turn his own people, against him. David is basically saying David is deceiving all of us, and so he's actually going to probably take us all out, right? But you know what? Someone comes to David's defense. Jonathan, the son of the king. We read this in verse 2. Jonathan warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. So Jonathan is revealing the plans to David. My dad's going to kill you. He wants to take you out. Not only does he do that with David, Jonathan actually goes to David's defense, to his dad in verse 4. It says, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. And Jonathan is going to his dad, and while his dad is so angry and so enraged, but he says, Saul, Dad, you have no right to do this. He defends David. He brags about him. Why would you kill him? Again, he's laid down his life for us. He conquered the enemy for us. He's an innocent man. He's saved us. So Saul, he has a brief change of heart. He pauses for a moment. We read this in verses 6 through 7. And hopefully that's what's up there too, because I can barely see it. So hopefully the people up there are watching as I go through this. Saul listened to Jonathan and took an oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. So again, David, he goes back into the household of Saul, the king's household. And now in verse 8, we see that there's a war again. There's another battle. It's going to be another battle against the Philistines. It says, once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. So again, war breaks out, and Saul needs someone to go to war. And would you fight for Saul if you were David? I wouldn't. I'd be like, fight your own battles. Again, what have you done for me that I should fight for you? You've demoted me, you disrespected me, you deceived me, you devised plans to kill me, and now you want to use my skills to win battle? I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. Again, that's not how David responds. That's not his heart. That's not his character. We pause and reflect on verses like this. We can really we can see why God would say that David was a man after God's own heart. And what does David do? I wouldn't go, but David does. David denies himself. David serves the king. He's a faithful servant. Success hasn't gone to his head. He's done all these great things, but he never says that this is beneath me. I'm not going to put myself in harm's way for this guy. That's not his heart. I believe the reason why David goes is because he's faithful. I believe that David is ruled by God, not by his circumstances or his feelings. And how often do we let our circumstances or our feelings kind of dictate how we're going to live and how we're going to act? It's a lot, isn't it? That throughout the week we go through all types of situations and all types of circumstances, and those circumstances produce these types of emotions and a lot of feelings, and those feelings often dictate how we're going to live and how we're going to act, how we're going to respond to others. David, he doesn't respond in this way. David follows God and God alone. It's not his circumstances, it's not his feelings. I don't know about you, but I'm challenged by this. For me, based upon how my day's going, I can easily just respond out of how things are going, how my emotions are feeling that day. But that's not David. That's not his heart. That's not his character. And then we read this in verses 9 through 10. It says, "Then an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape." I think it's interesting in verse 9, do you notice that there's a contrast between these two men? Saul, he has a spear in his hand. And David, he has a lyre, a harp in his. Again, what's that? Why is he doing that? He's playing music for the Saul. He's trying to be a blessing to the person who hates him. He's playing songs for David in order to calm his spirit. Again, David is trying to bless the person who despises him. But Saul, he tries to kill him. Again, in verse 10, Saul tries to kill him with a spear, and David, he runs away. And then the rest of 1 Samuel, we see David on the run from Saul. He's fleeing for his life because he's the enemy of the king. Even though he has to flee, though, we see over and over again that God is with him. That God is going to protect him, even though Saul's going to go ruthlessly after him. Can Saul actually kill David? No. Remember, God had anointed David as the future king, and God doesn't break his promises. He'll protect David while he's on the run from Saul. We've already seen that God used Jonathan to protect David. Now in verses 11 through 12, David's own wife, God uses David's own wife, Michal. Let's read that. It says, "Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, 'If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed.' So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped." So again, Saul is devising a plan to kill David. And Jonathan had previously saved him. Now Michal, his wife, saves him. In verse 18, God uses another person. He uses Samuel, God's own prophet. It says in verse 18, "When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there." So again, David, he's fleeing for his life. He knows that Samuel's at Ramah, and he goes there, and in Ramah, he just spills the beans on what Saul was doing to him. Saul's after me. He shares all the things that's happening. And in verse 19, Saul actually hears that David made it to Ramah, and starts to go after him. And then when we read this in verse 20. "So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their lead, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied." So again, Saul is sending men and basically soldiers to take David, and all of a sudden the Spirit of God overpowers these enemies, and they begin to worship God. The Spirit of God stops the evil intents of these men. The Spirit of God causes these men to worship God. And because of this, Saul, he keeps sending more and more men to try to capture and kill David. This keeps happening, though. 3 times Saul tries this, but this keeps happening. They stop, and the Spirit of God comes on them, and they would worship God. But finally, in verse 22, Saul decides to take matters in his own hands. He's like, if my men can't do this, I'm going to do it myself. But you know what? God is faithful to protect him. We read this in verses 23 and 24. "So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him, and he went along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He laid naked all that day and all that night." Again, what I think is happening here in this story, again, it's kind of a weird couple verses, but what's happening is the Spirit of God is coming upon Saul, and he's worshiping God, but he also gets stripped naked because it's to show Saul that he's been defeated. It crushes him. He's been crushed. It's that he's humiliated through this. There's humiliation. The Spirit of God comes upon Saul to spoil his plans, his evil intent. So again, David, he's protected, isn't he? But he's still on the run still. He still has to flee. And what we'll be noticing so far in these last couple chapters is that, basically everything that's been precious to him has been removed from him. David is learning how to trust God when he's all by himself. David here is learning to trust in God alone. God's going to take all these earthly things away from David because he wants David to rely only on him, not on all these other earthly type possessions. You can look at all the things that David has lost so far in the last couple chapters. He's lost his job, he lost his house, he lost his wife Michal. Samuel's gone too. We didn't read that, but Samuel's gone. We see in chapter 20 that he'll lose Jonathan too. And one of the things that we know is actually during this time that David wrote a beautiful psalm called Psalm 59 during this time. This is a time that he was on the run and he lost everything. And this Psalm 59, is all about his hope being in God and God alone. That God is David's only hope. God is his only reliance. Now, as we turn the corner in chapter 20, and we see David he flees to Jonathan. We read this in verse 1. And David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he's trying to kill me?" He's basically saying, why on earth is your dad trying to kill me? And in verse 2, Jonathan doesn't believe David because his dad tells him everything. So David responds to Jonathan through here in verse 3. It says, "But David took an oath and said, 'Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes.' And he has said to himself, 'Jonathan must not know this, or he'll be grieved. Yet as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only a step between me and death.'" He's basically saying, Jonathan, your dad's trying to kill me. He's cut you out of the loop because he knows how you feel about me. Now I'm just a fraction away from death. So Jonathan and David, they devise a plan. Design a test. David designs a test to help Jonathan know whether or not his dad actually wants him dead or not. And we read that plan here in verses 5 through 7. So David said, "Look, tomorrow is a new moon feast, and I'm supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him David earnestly asked permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for this whole clan. If he says, 'Very well,' then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he is determined to harm me." So this is a real simple test, isn't it? David and Saul are supposed to have dinner together. David's not going to show up. He's going to hide. And if Saul is asked where David is, Jonathan's just going to say, I gave him permission to go home. And if he's happy with it, Saul's not trying to kill him. But if he's mad, Jonathan's going to know without a doubt that his dad wants to kill David. If David actually went to his hometown for an annual sacrifice, that would have been a very reasonable request. It's been something that Saul should approve of. But what we actually read throughout this is that Saul he actually explodes with anger because of this. And it's because he wants this guy dead. We read this, if you jump with me all the way down to 30, we read his response. It says, "Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, 'You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, do I know that you've sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you?'" So he lashes out his own son. This is a curse right here in verse 30. He says Saul sees Jonathan's honor to David as something that's evil and foolish. You are foolish by aligning yourself with David. Not only is it dumb what you're doing, it's wicked. How dare you align yourself with him and not me? And not only does Saul yell at Jonathan, we see him do this in verse 33. Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him, his own son. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in a fierce anger. On that second day of the feast, he did not eat because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. So as we wrap up here this morning, if you read through the rest of chapter 20, you'll see that David, he's now officially an outlaw. And for the next several weeks, we'll see that he's on the run and how God's going to continually protect him and how David's going to respond when things don't go his way. But as we close here this morning, I just want you to place yourself in David's shoes. Again, he's been stripped of everything, right? He has lost everything minus his life. David lost everything that would be dear to him. He lost his job, he lost his wife, he lost his house, he lost his spiritual advisor in Samuel. He's losing his best friend Jonathan since he can't connect with him while he's on the run. He's completely separated from everything that's dear to him. If you were in David's shoes, how would you respond? Would you blame God or question his existence or his character? Would you be focused on all the bad and terrible things that has happened to you? Which again, these are all horrible and bad things right here. And would you let that consume you? Or would you allow these things to turn your attention to the one who can bring deliverance and care? So how does David respond? He takes his cues from God. He takes his cues not from his situations, not from his circumstances, not from his feelings. He says, I'm going to trust you because I know, God, you are good and you are faithful. Remember, the big idea for today is that we're called to be ruled by God, not by our situations or circumstances or our feelings. So today I need to ask ourselves this question of who or what is the ruler of your life? Is it God? Or is it your circumstances? Is it your faith in God, or is it your situation? Is it the truths, the eternal truths of God, or is it your temporary feelings? Who or what is the ruler of your life? If you're anything like me, you'll probably answer this question by saying, it's probably more often my circumstances or my feelings. And so if that's you, I want to ask you this question of what can you do, what can we do now when we're in the midst of good times, of good situations, good things, to help strengthen our faith when we go through those hard, difficult, bad times, those challenging times? What habits do we need to have in place in order to help us to be ruled by God so that we have a foundation when we come up with difficult and challenging circumstances? For me, the thing that's been the most helpful for me is to be part of a Christian community. To be part of a community that has helped me to be cultivated as a disciple. We need people in our lives that speak truth when we want to believe the lies of our feelings and our circumstances. We need brothers and sisters that we can turn to help to speak truth when we're just devastated by the events of life. Again, if you don't have those people in your life right now, you need that. If you don't have those people in your life right now, you need that. You need that. If you don't have that right now, I encourage you to take steps to get that. I encourage you can talk to myself, you can talk to Amanda Clever, she's our discipleship chair. We'd love to help you get connected, whether to a Sunday school class, to a discipleship group. Again, whatever group it is, you need that community that can speak truth into your life when it's so easy to focus on all of our challenging and difficult and hard circumstances. Because when Jesus saved us, we not only became children of God, we also were able to become brothers and sisters to those children. We weren't saved into isolation, but into a true and loving community. And too many times we treat our relationship with Jesus as a me and me alone thing. But our faith in Jesus means that we get to be part of a community that God uses to provide all the things that we need. The care, the provision, the support, the encouragement. God provides everything that we need through that church family community. And so I encourage you to run to that. Run to that with that's hard. Run to those people when it's hard, when you grieve on hard and terrible times with them. Run to those people when you go through the difficult situations because you need those folks to encourage you, to remind you of the key truths of God. Because God has given us community to remind us that whether we're in the good or in the bad, that God is still on the throne. You know what? That makes all the difference. Let's pray. And Father in heaven, we know that your word is like a sword. It's meant to judge the thoughts and the attitudes of our hearts. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of you. My prayer for us this morning that we would all take our cues from you. That we not look to our circumstances or to our feelings, but know that you are good. That we're going to be ruled by you because you are righteous and you know what's best for us. And God, if there's anyone here that hasn't trusted Jesus, the Son of God, who came, who died to defeat sin, Satan, and death, and to give us a righteousness we can't earn or deserve, would you direct their hearts to Jesus? He's the author and the perfecter of the faith, the one who loves and forgives and longs to send grace that we might have life. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.